heading up the standards system at Textile Exchange. I'm going to wait just a few more seconds because I know some people are still logging in and it takes a bit of time for people to get into the Zoom system. So we'll get going in just a little bit. Okay, we're a minute after, so I'm going to get started. I saw the number of people growing, but it's steady now. So I'm happy to bring this specific session on the new standard system focused on recycled materials to everyone today. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of what we have ahead of us. This is who you're going to be hearing from today, myself. We have Videsh Kadam joining to talk through the more specific information about criteria related to recycled materials. And then Callie Weldon is here to explain a bit more about other engagement activities that we have coming. Before we get started, we really want to know who is joining us. So we put together this Menti. This is intended to get a bit more details about where you're joining from around the world and what part of the supply chain you're representing or other stakeholder perspective that you're joining for. I'm going to leave this up for just a few seconds so people, if you want to use the QR code, that you can do that now, but we'll also put this information in the chat for you to access. And we'll also leave this Menti up for 1 week. So if you don't want to do this now, it's quick, but if you don't want to do this now so that you can focus on the content of the webinar, it will be available for you afterwards. I also want to let people know how we're going to manage the questions coming from all of you. We definitely want questions. They're really helpful for us to know, where there may be confusion or where we need to be more clear. It's also helpful for other participants to hear questions and the answers, and it prompts more questions, which is great. The way that we're going to do this, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's where you'll enter your questions. So it will all be from your side as participants done in writing. And then some of those questions we'll be able to answer in writing as well, and we'll share with everybody. But we will save questions also to answer live at the end. So what's best is when questions come to mind, go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box as we're going through the content. And then that will give us a bit of time to sort out who would come in and be able to answer when we go to the live session at the end for Q&A. And this is the agenda that we have today. I'm going to walk us through the scene setting and talk a bit more broadly about our standard system and where we're going into the future, and then what we're specifically doing with the new standard development and the release of the pilot version of a standard that we just had done earlier this month, with the scope of that and the timeline, and then some of the activities that we have planned this year. And then I'll hand over to Videsh to talk more specifically about criteria related to recycled materials and the processing of those materials, and also MMCF, so man-made cellulosics, both recycled and virgin. We have content on that as well. And then hand over to Callie to talk about some of the engagement activities and other ways to stay updated on the process that we're going through. So just to get us set on the background, a lot of the information that we've presented over the last 2 years has explained that because Textile Exchange has several different material-specific standards, we had made a decision that to be more efficient, it was best to bring those together under a harmonized system and look where we have cross-cutting criteria that we can be more streamlined in terms of how we're developing those criteria and training on the systems related to those criteria. So that was our first objective in moving forward with a unified standard system. The other thing that we had decided to do was, because as an organization, we developed a climate and nature strategy with specific focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 within the tier 4 part of the supply chain in the textile industry. We realized this was really important for us to take that into consideration as we move forward with this new standard system. What can we do within an auditing and certification context to also be looking at outcomes related to climate and nature? So that's been a big part of the development of the standard system and the criteria that we've been sharing over last year with the draft consultations, and then this year with the most recent release of the standard. And then additional to that, there's of course the whole standard system. So it's not just the criteria that are evaluated during audits, it's also the assurance policies that we have in place, the claims and labeling system, how we work with our certification bodies. We're looking at the entirety of our system and all of the different policies and templates, guidelines that we have in place, and making sure that those are both effectively in place for the new standard that we're developing, but then also have future proofing in terms of other things that are happening, like that we're all aware that different governments, in particular the EU and some other countries around the world, have been developing policies around sustainability systems and about the tracing of origin of materials and some specific attributes related to those. So we want to be looking at what's happening in policy development and how can we align in our standard system. And some of those policy developments and just other trends that are happening relate to what are acceptable claims, what's compelling for consumers, but also clear and understandable for consumers. So all of these different components that make up our standard system are part of the revision process that we're undertaking right now. And with that, I've been a bit vague on the, not saying the unified standard anymore. That's how we've been referring to this new standard development over the last 2 years. But with the most recent release of the pilot version of the standard, we're also excited to provide the broader community with the new name that we have for our standard, which is the Materials Matter Standard. So you will see, I wanted to make sure people are aware this is the new name. We had been planning this name for the last year and then decided to roll it out now so we can get people used to using this new name and hearing the name. And we also have a logo that's been in development to match the name, as well as other branding elements. So what you're seeing now in the materials that we've published on our website is the new name of the standard, and then we'll have the logo and other branding elements coming out in our annual conference that's taking place in October in the Los Angeles area. So stay tuned for more of that branding to be released later this year. And just in case you missed it, you're at this webinar, but definitely be aware that we published what we're calling the pilot version of the new standard system on our website at the beginning of June. And that's why we're having this webinar and other webinars that we've been holding this month to make sure and get the word out, the news to different standards users to know what we've been doing. I am going to talk a bit more about what we mean by having a pilot version of the standard. But before that, just be aware that on our website, there's the full standard in all of the criteria across all of the materials that are in scope. But we've also prepared different tailored versions where we've extracted criteria specific to different materials. You see those over on the right side of the screen. So this is helpful for people if you want to drill in specifically on the material that's of interest for you, then you can access that tailored version. We also have summary papers that are posted online. We did this with the first 2 drafts of the standard that we released last year for public consultation. The intention with the summary papers is to help guide people through how to navigate the standard, how to understand the architecture, the terminology, and also to provide highlights on the key changes that have been made. So in the last year, we were focused a bit on like how the draft criteria were evolving. In this pilot version, what you'll find is how criteria, what are the most significant changes that we want to highlight to you based on our current standards today, the suite of material specific standards, and how those criteria have evolved into the materials matter standard. So that's important information to look at those summary papers. The other thing is that because this webinar is focused on recycled materials, this whole part of the background that I'm doing is more brief than what we did in our original launch webinar that happened on June 11th. So either you can access that recording if you want to get more details on the content of the standard overall and the navigation, or you can also open up one of the summary papers and that will help guide you through as well. So I'm going to get into the scope of the standard, which is a bit of a reminder, and then the timeline that we have ahead of us. So the materials matter standard itself is designed at Tier 4, which is the raw material production and first processing through all of the different processing phases that are pre-spinning if it's a fiber-based material in the scope. So that's where we've been doing our intensive development. Those are the criteria that we've looked at in comparison to the climate and nature strategy that we have as an organization. And that's what we're presenting in the pilot version of the standard. When that certified raw material leaves Tier 4 and enters the rest of the supply chain, it is our content claim standard that remains in place. So that's the standard, the CCS that we have today for chain of custody, and that will continue to be the standard that we have for tracking and handling of that certified material as it goes through the rest of the supply chain. So just something I want to make sure people are aware of when you look at the materials matter standard, that it is focused on Tier 4. And that means, so at Tier 4, the type of criteria that we have been developing, and in particular, when we've looked at the outcomes that we want to drive and monitor related to our climate and nature strategy, you can see on the left side of the screen those different categories of the impact areas. In many cases, these criteria have pre-existed. They're in our standards today. In some cases, there are new criteria. And in all cases, we've been looking at what is the way that we can adapt our criteria to be more outcomes driven and also provide clarity around how the criteria are intended to be implemented and evaluated during audits. So that's been the bulk of what we have been working on and what we shared last year in the draft standards and then in this pilot version. And then on the right side of the screen, you will see that the materials that are included. So all materials in our standards today are part of the Materials Matter standard. And then you see some that have an asterisk. And those are ones that we have identified are also important in terms of Tier 4 and those impact areas that we want to have evaluated and the type of data that we want to be monitoring towards outcomes. But in the ones that are asterisk, they're ones where we know there are already other sustainability standards in place in the marketplace, and we do not want to come in and duplicate that work that's already been done. It's to everybody's benefit if we look towards establishing partnerships with other standards organizations in the interest of, what we're calling recognition. So those certified raw materials could be recognized and accepted as they enter the rest of the Materials Matter supply chain through the content claim standard. The process for looking at materials for recognition is it's a parallel development to the full Materials Matter standard, but those materials will come into the system at different timeframes based on the development of those other relationships. So they're on a different timeline than the base standard that we've provided just recently. And that's what I'm going to explain here is how we've had different versions of the standard already. So this year we started with a review of the second draft consultation feedback that we received. We worked on the criteria based on that feedback, and then we reviewed the content with our international working group to get approval of being able to publish that standard. And so we moved forward earlier this year with the pilot version and released that to participants in pilot testing that I'll talk about in a couple minutes. And then what you all have accessible to you on our website is the fully published pilot version that's on our website. And the difference between, here in June and then October is just the branding that's on the standard itself. So when you open the PDF document, currently it has the name, but doesn't have the new logo. And then we'll repost that standard in October with all of the branding elements added, but we won't have changes to the criteria at that time. What we're doing this year is going through the pilot testing in the field and then also various different updates and engagement activities focused on the criteria. So during all of those processes, we're going to be learning a lot about the criteria and the feasibility of how they're written or which criteria we have in place. So we need to get that learning in place and then move forward with refining further and then finalizing the criteria. And we need to do that in early 2025 so that we can meet the timeline that we have for publishing the final standard out to the public by the middle of 2025. So that's where you see that we have the different releases. So the final version of the standard that has the set content that will be available for auditing and certification is planned to be released in the middle of 2025. And then what we do as best practice in our standard system is allow time for the various different standard users to be able to open up the document, and, analyze the criteria, understand the changes that have happened in the criteria from, auditing and certification that's happening today to where things are going in the future. That all takes time for the certification bodies and the certified organizations to be able to look at how this impacts their systems and the updates that they need to make and the training that they need to conduct. So we allow at least 6 months for that to transpire before the standard becomes effective. And effective in the beginning of 2026 means that companies can start to request to have their audit on a voluntary basis to the new standard. And then we move to when the standard finally becomes mandatory. And that means from that point forward, which we have the timeline currently set for middle of 2026, all audits that are according to the scope of the Materials Matter standard need to be conducted against that standard. So for example, if a company today is certified to the GRS or the RCS, by the middle of 2026, their audit that is scheduled from that point forward will be against the new standard criteria. So that's giving insight into what we have planned ahead. And also just to be clear that the pilot version is not the version that will be audited with certificates issued. We still have a bit of time for the development before that becomes the case. So I've been referencing that this is the pilot version of the standard, and there's pilot testing that is planned this year. It's actually already underway. This was not part of our original plan, but became very clear to us that the changes in the criteria were significant enough that we needed to take a step back and allow this year to be used for pilot testing and the other policy and systems updates, and that to do that effectively, we need to be open-minded to learning. And so going out in the field, testing the feasibility of the criteria and the accessibility for organizations to understand the criteria and to implement systems to be in conformance with them, Those are all really important activities to help us learn about how we've developed the criteria and if we need to make further changes. So we decided to take this year to allow those activities to happen before finalizing and publishing the standard. The objectives that we have with pilot testing this year, on the left side of the screen, this is what we're currently conducting, is getting out into the field in different contexts, so different materials, different countries, and ground truthing the criteria that's in the pilot version. And that allows us to spend more time with the certification body auditors and the certified organizations to be able to talk through the intention behind the criteria, test how they would be evaluated, look at what is the gap that we have from knowledge today versus how the criteria are moving. So how much additional type of support and tools are needed to understand the criteria. And then also what's really important is looking at what type of expertise is needed and what is the level of effort for audits taking place. So how much have the criteria impacted the time required for an audit in the field, and looking at the cost benefit analysis of that. Then we are moving into later this year other things that are being developed that supplement the standard and the feasibility of those tools as well. So our monitoring, evaluation, and learning indicators, so those directly relate to information and data that we want to collect to be able to measure and monitor the outcomes. So we need to look at the feasibility of that data that we have, that we're looking at for MEL, and then also the system that's needed to ingest data. So the audit report checklist, other tools like questionnaires that go to certified sites, looking at how those are developed and how that information is stored in our track it system, and then relates to how we want to report out that information. So those are different tools that we want to be looking at getting feedback on starting later this year. And then specifically for recycled materials and man-made cellulosics, we have another slide that looks at other materials in the system, but for this presentation, we're focused on these areas. This is the needs assessment that we conducted last year in terms of the type of context that we want to go out into the field and do the pilot testing. So you can see that we have had 2 pilots conducted already, recycled wool in Italy and recycled cotton and other materials in Turkey. And then we have other opportunities for piloting that are under discussion. So the other ones that you see listed here are in various phases of confirmation. So this is not 100% in place. These are based on where we will ideally conduct pilots. And that's what we're aiming to do, is have all of the pilot testing wrapping up by September. And so these activities would be happening over the next couple of months. And then by September, that's where we can really start to examine all of the different learnings from the pilot testing to then help refine the criteria, like the timeline that I have given before. You can also see on the slide, specifically for recycled and MMCF, the type of areas that we want to be looking at. So the pilot test is not just like a mock audit to go in and like what would an evaluation look like against these criteria, but we also have specific concepts in the criteria that we want to spend more time unpacking in each of those pilot activities. In this next section is where we're going to get into more details about the criteria. I'm going to cover the first part, which is about human rights and livelihoods, and then I am going to hand over to Videsh. In human rights and livelihoods, this is what we're calling a principle. A principle is basically a section of like criteria. And the main thing I want to highlight with this part of the standard is, for our global recycled standard, any of you that are participating in that standard and familiar with that, then you know that there is a social module that's included, and social equates to human rights and livelihoods in our system. The recycled claim standard, the RCS, does not have that component. So that's a significant change to be aware of, is that at Tier 4 processing, the human rights and livelihoods principle will be required for all participants in the new standards system. The other thing that I want to make sure and highlight about this part of the standard is there is quite a bit of change and kind of development of new concepts that the intention we have is to align with globally recognized human rights due diligence frameworks. And that includes the United Nations Guiding Principles on Human Rights and the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains. And those are trends that we see are becoming, in the future will become the norm. And so we're looking at how can we align with those systems. And that is probably the majority of the change that people will see in the criteria. And I want to give the caveat to that, which is this is a big part of the value of doing the pilot testing, because we want to get out into different situations with organizations and understand what is the gap of knowledge and what would be the leap that needs to be taken to meet this type of new approach in the human rights space. So that will give us insight on the feasibility that we need to take back and evaluate, and also what are different ways that we can support the understanding of these new concepts. But ultimately, it's in the interest of aligning with where we see that the industry is going in the future. We have, as well, the similar type of social module requirements in place. And in those cases, there's been refinement, because every time a standard is revised, it's an opportunity to re-examine how things have been working and where do we need to make modifications to criteria. But a big part of the other thing I want to highlight is there's a shift in terms of organizations doing a risk assessment on what are the areas of highest risk within their operations and the context that they're working. And then that allows them to focus on those specific areas in terms of how they demonstrate conformance. And that relates to this last bullet point about, then what is the auditor focused on? And it's looking at the risk assessment that the company has conducted and the type of due diligence systems they have in place to help mitigate those risks. And with that, I am going to hand over to Videsh.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants joining from across the globe. So today I'm going to give you a quick update on the recycled materials as well as the man-made cellulosic fibers. So before we jump into this topic, a brief update, a brief heads up to all of you that the criteria in the material matter standard for the processing facilities section is built upon the global recycle standard GRS principles, meaning the GRS environmental management section is a baseline requirement for the material matter standard. So this was just a heads up before we dive into the requirements. So the first big change in this subsection, that is chemical management and restrictions, that is applicable to recycled materials, is a requirement to exclude chemicals classified with hazard codes listed in GRS has changed from compulsory for certification to a leadership criterion in the material matter standard. So what does it basically mean is that the hazard code requirement that is there in GRS is now will be a voluntary requirement, a voluntary criterion moving forward in the material matter standard. And the reason for this change is that, as we all know, the chemicals and the chemistries that are used in first stage processing, like fiber manufacturing or polymer manufacturing or chemical recycling, are building blocks and cannot be easily be replaced. So instead of having prohibition or restriction on the use of these chemicals, it is expected that facilities implement advanced chemical management practices, such as but not limited to closed loop recycling, recovery of chemicals and solvents, so on and so forth. So the expectation is that the advanced chemical management practices are in place, and the hazard code criterion would become then a voluntary criterion moving forward in the material matter standard. On the similar lines, we have also updated the ZDHC MRSL requirement, which has been now replaced by new criteria, new ZDHC MMCF, new ZDHC guidelines, basically, that are more relevant to the first stage processing. Again, as you may be aware, or you might have also felt this difficulty, that ZDHC MRSL is applicable to downstream textile wet processing operations. So it was a logical step to replace the ZDHC MRSL guideline and with other relevant guidelines, such as the MMCF guideline for the man-made cellulosic fibers and other upcoming fiber guidelines which are in pipeline from ZDHC that will be more relevant to the first stage processing. We have also introduced another new criterion, which is focused on analysis or testing of recycled outputs. Although we have not set any limits that have to be met, and the criterion has been introduced to start collecting data to learn from. So, although this requirement is also there in GRS, but it's just a suggestion and recommendation. So what do we expect from the facilities at the moment is that they do perform a risk management, risk assessment, and they also take into consideration the materials that they are working with and define their own testing protocol. So they can define what parameters they want to test, they can define the frequency of testing, or they can also align with any global RSL limit values, or they are required to meet the requirement of the country of sale of the product. So this is the expectation from this criterion about analysis or testing of recycled outputs. So let's move on to the next slide. I hope the earlier part was clear, and I'm coming to this processing facilities section. So environmental requirements in the GRS focuses only on having environmental management system in place and fulfilling local regulations. So there is a shift in the criteria for organizations going beyond the baseline requirement, which was set in GRS, and to achieve more than what has already been established by GRS. So to name a few new requirements, new conformance-based requirements, as well as leadership criteria, we have introduced criteria around setting science-based targets, along with plans to achieve those targets, criteria around climate and nature goals, criteria around monitoring and tracking of greenhouse gas emissions, and criteria around transitioning towards renewable sources of energy. So these are some of the examples, some of the changes that we have made going forward in the material matter standard. Waste management. So this is also an important topic for recyclers and the MMCF producers. We have introduced a new criterion for continuous chemical recyclers that focuses on reporting on input, output, and waste generation. So this is very critical from the chemical recyclers point of view to understand the quantity of waste that has been generated and whether it's hazardous or non-hazardous. We have also introduced a new leadership or voluntary criterion for recycled material feedstocks to come from reclaimed pre and post consumer textile input in an effort to promote textile to textile recycling. So as you may be aware, there are upcoming regulations around closed loop recycling and the risk that these regulations may possess to the existing open loop recycling model of PET bottles into textiles. So we want to emphasize, or we want to encourage the industry to transit towards more or adopt towards more textile to textile recycling, given in consideration the regulations that will be soon coming into near future. The next new criteria is about the new conformance-based criteria that accepts and allows the reutilization of byproducts and materials considered as ineligible for pre and post-consumer materials used in manufacturing. So basically, this criteria has been developed, and it acknowledges the industry efforts of the reuse of the material and emphasizes the waste hierarchy model. So the plans are underway to include a new sustainable claim for such feedstocks that would re-enter the supply chain. So these claims would be different from recycled content claims. So here we want to recognize the industry practice of reuse and also want to promote waste hierarchy model, and hence we want to recognize, or we want to allow these materials to be considered for the certification as well. We have also introduced another leadership or voluntary criterion for organizations to demonstrate commitment, progress, and tangible results towards diverging from business as usual practices and investing in new materials and processes that yield lower environmental impact. So this is based upon the Paris Agreement or the climate and nature goals that we have adopted internally to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. Organizations have to move away from business as usual practices and fill in this gap by innovating or working with new materials and new processes that would eventually lead to lower the greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. Moving on to the next slide. Water use and discharge. Again, over here, it's a learnings learned from GRS. Basically, the sites of facilities discharging effluent to offsite facilities are not compelled to test as per ZDHC wastewater guidelines, but need to adhere to local legal discharge mandates. So these were the feedback that we got during the GRS. Similarly, sites where ZDHC wastewater guideline does not cover effluent from polymer manufacturing under its scope would follow dedicated pulp, MMCF, and recycled polyester guidelines that will soon be published by ZDHC. So ZDHC, there are certain guidelines that are in pipeline with ZDHC, and they will cover the dedicated requirements for wastewater discharge for these manufacturing and production activities. Moving on to the next slide. Air emissions. So over here, we have introduced a new criterion for organizations to have plans to monitor, measure, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions. So this is basically a summary of what the air emissions subsection talks about. Similarly, in energy use, we have also introduced a new criteria that requires organizations to monitor, measure, and reduce conventional fossil-based energy sources. And we have also introduced another leadership of voluntary criterion to transition towards adoption of renewable sources of energy and to replace old inefficient equipment with energy efficient models. So these were some of the very high level changes that we have made in the material matter standard for the recycle that would be applicable for the recycle materials. So now we'll quickly go on to the MMCF update as well. Chemical management and restriction. Similarly, as mentioned earlier, the MMCF facilities manufacturing cellulosic filament fibers, irrespective of the feedstock, whether it's virgin or recycled, must meet foundational or progressive or aspirational requirements set in the latest version of the GDHC MMCF guidelines. So as mentioned earlier, we have got rid or removed the GDHC MRSL requirement and replace it with guidelines that are more relevant to the first stage manufacturing. We have also introduced a new criteria on dissolving pulp processing, including prohibition of elemental chlorine for bleaching of dissolving pulp. And another new criteria is responsible manufacturing and chemical recovery for dissolving pulp by either implementing EU BREF production of paper pulps or implementing ZDHC MMCF guidelines. Over here, I just want to give a quick highlight, flag over here that although EU BREF paper production pulp is not applicable to the dissolved grade pulp, but we feel that it's a good starting point to refer to, and the criteria are subject to change going forward. So once the ZDHC adopts or includes the dissolved pulp production under its MMCF guideline, we would then require facilities to implement the latest version of the ZDHC MMCF guideline. Another new criteria that we have introduced is to foster innovation, similarly as mentioned earlier, particularly for MMCFs, to encourage advancements such as textile to textile recycling, or the adoption of safer and less hazardous novel solvents and chemicals in cellulosic filament fiber manufacturing processes. So again, this criteria is in line with our climate and nature goal that requires organizations to move away from business as usual practices and invest in adoption of safer and less hazardous chemicals or innovative materials and innovative processes going forward. So let's move on to the next slide. Water use and discharge. We again want to reinforce over here that dissolving pulp processes using virgin or recycled inputs and MMCF filament fiber yarn manufacturers are required to fulfill the effluent discharge requirements outlined in the ZDHC MMCF guidelines. So ZDHC MMCF guidelines are expected to be updated to include these provisions by end of 2024. So the updated version of ZDHC MMCF guideline will be including dissolved pulp manufacturing as well as the from the virgin as well as the recycle inputs as well. We have also and similarly in the energy use, we have taken a look at the feedback that we got from the earlier versions that were released, the draft 2 and draft 1. So we have taken into consideration the feedback that we received specifically from the MMCF producers that certain leadership or voluntary criteria that were included have been removed from the current version, the pilot version of the material matter standard, as these criteria got into much details and specifics of MMCF operational requirements. So it did not make sense to have such a detailed requirement as a criteria going forward. We have also introduced a new criteria around dissolved pulp manufacturers to recover value from their spent liquors by generating 50% of on-site electricity and steam from their spent liquors. Just to highlight that this criterion is only applicable to dissolved pulp produced from virgin inputs. Going forward, MMCF approach to recognition. Uh, as mentioned by Laura earlier, we are working on a framework for recognition partnerships, and we are going to accept virgin feedstocks that are certified by other sustainability standards. So this concept is still under development and will be ready on a different time frame other when we compare it with the standard. So give you an idea. There are two different types of recognition models. So one of it is a specific recognition model. So in this model, we are recognizing the ZDHC MMCF guidelines. Basically, this is done so that it includes one or more areas of verification examples, specific standard criteria that are aligned with new core criteria for a defined impact area. So we are aligning or we have recognized this ZDHC MMCF guideline for our wastewater impact area as well as chemical management impact area. Similarly, there is also another recognition model, maybe a future recognition. We are going to recognize feedstocks and processes like carbon capture. So this will be a full recognition model where we'll be recognizing the feedstocks that will be coming into us into our system. But again, as mentioned, this concept is still under development and will be ready on a different time frame later on. So that was it from my side, and thank you all for joining in and listening in. And if there are any questions, I think we'll take them later on at the end. And back to you, over to you, Kelly. Now, thank you.
Thanks, Videsh. So I'm going to take you through some of the engagement activities that we have planned for overall with the Materials Matter Standard pilot launch, but then specifically with this community of stakeholders. And just to highlight some of the reasons, this is actually our last virtual webinar series. We're going to be hosting much more virtual events and opportunities to engage in the future, but for the launch purpose, this is our last webinar that we're hosting regarding the different stakeholder communities. But we will be going to visit regions on the ground this summer and fall. So we really want to make sure that we're not just putting out a pilot standard and pilot criteria and letting it sit. As Laura mentioned, we are hosting many different pilot activities in many different regions of the world. And so we also want to make sure that we're hosting workshops and engagement activities with those who aren't necessarily piloting the criteria, but will be piloting in a way on their own once the standard is being implemented. And then also giving us an opportunity to continue to collect comments on the current pilot version of the criteria. So we're hosting these in an effort to host dynamic conversations, really start to get into some of the complex topics that make these standards so global and unique. And there's so many different certified organizations that are applying them in different contexts, different business models. And so going on the ground and really starting these conversations and continuing the conversation is important to the development of the standard. And then also to create a safe environment to enable peer-to-peer learning, and also to collect critique and feedback on where we're headed in different areas that are still under development. So for the recycling community, we're looking at a pilot workshop. The date is still to be announced. We will be sending out more specific information to certified organizations, roundtable members. We'll be posting it on the Standards Hub community. So watch out for different announcements. These are targeted for Tier 4 and kind of first stage processors. We are looking at stakeholders such as brokers in the animal fiber context, or there is room for some other types of stakeholders to join, but the purpose is really to be enabling conversations on the ground with those who, like I said, will be implementing the actual criteria of this pilot version of the standard. So we will be in Prato, Italy this fall, and we'll be looking to have a workshop focused on recycled wool and then textile to textile recycling, which are two of the pilots that Laura mentioned earlier in her slides. So we will see you there, hopefully, and present more information online about what this looks like, how you can get involved, how to register, and what type of content to expect at these workshops. And then also for more virtual engagement opportunities, we'll be posting those in the Hub community and our newsletters as well. And that's all from me. We are accepting question and answer now. We have a good amount of time to go through. We have a couple coming through in the chat box now, but please feel free to add them as we go. So the first questions, Laura, are probably more for you. They're kind of joint in relation to recognition. So people are curious about kind of if there's a list that we're considering, or if we have certain programs for like what could be included, for example, in cotton that we could go over, and just kind of in general to talk a little bit to the recognition piece.
Yeah, definitely. So we do have a draft recognition framework that we will be sharing in the coming months with the community. In terms of the different standards organizations that we're considering, we so far have only been giving examples. So we're not talking about specific names of any organizations that we're already in discussion with. That would be at a later stage when we have a memorandum of understanding signed with them, where it allows both of us to talk about forming a partnership and how we're going forward. But examples that we've been giving in different public situations is, when we're looking at virgin feedstock for man-made cellulosics, the standards that come to mind are both FSC and PEFC. Those are responsible forestry management standards. So they're likely candidates for us to, of course, we would have to have those conversations with them, make sure they're willing to form a partnership, and then we would move into, those different phases of how we look at alignment on climate and nature and measuring outcomes and areas like that. And so far we're just giving examples like that. And that covers all of those different materials that were in the asterisk, right? So not just for man-made cellulosics, but also what we're looking at for feedstocks for biosynthetics and cotton and cashmere as well. And then I had seen, yes, that there was the other question about cotton standards. So a couple important points about cotton in our future standard system. The first thing is that we are maintaining the organic cotton content standard, the OCS, in parallel to the materials matter standard. So we will still have that place for organic materials in our future standard system. But organic is not completely aligned with what we're doing in the materials matter standard. So that's why we need to keep it separate for the time being. And that also means that we will be opening up a revision to the OCS in the future. As we get closer to that time frame, it's still several months out, but we will be clear with the broader community about when that is planned. And the other thing is that cotton is one of those materials that has the asterisk, so we are open to partnering with other cotton programs and standards and looking at recognition. And that is also a reason why cotton and other materials that are candidates for recognition, you'll actually see them in the standard, the materials matter standard. And the reason is to be ready for when those relationships, partnerships develop and get formalized, will have those materials at that first processing stage. So that's when the certified raw material at origin comes into first processing, then our standard system will pick them up. And so we wanted to make sure that they were included in the criteria where we list out applicable materials.
Thanks. And then we have another question that might be Laura and Videsh. It's about tier 4 in this sector. So does this refer to the collectors of the used bottles, or who is tier 4 in this use case? And then maybe talking to how collectors fit in as well.
So maybe Videsh, I'll start and then you can fill in if I leave anything out. So when it comes to the recycling process, the same way that it's working today with the GRS and RCS is what's in scope for the materials matter standard, at least initially. So certification begins with the recycling facility, and the suppliers, the concentrators and the collectors are not required at this point to get certified. We consider that that will be a big step in introducing that kind of change to the system, and we're already introducing a lot of other changes in the criteria. So we're trying to manage, how much change we roll out all at the same time. What we are doing in terms of the feedstock supply coming to the recycling facilities is looking at how we can strengthen the requirements around input verification. So those of you working in that space are familiar with the material declaration form that we have. We've been already reviewing that form and moving it into a digitized format so that it can feed directly into our system and have data available for us. That's going to be required in terms of compliance with government policy anyway, so it's really important for us to move in that direction, but it also gives better insight in a more data-driven way about the supply chain and the suppliers to recycling facilities. And then in terms of the actual starting balance, the volume that's coming in, increasing what is the verification around those areas. And some of that may mean that recyclers would like to request that their suppliers get certified, and that is definitely an option, and that would resolve that input verification. But we want to keep the option for the time being that those suppliers may not be certified, but are considered part of the scope that's evaluated by the certification body. So hopefully that answered it, and Videsh, definitely jump in if there's more to share.
Oh no, I think you have covered it pretty much. Yeah. So we are strengthening the RMDF, the Reclaimed Material Declaration form, and yes, we are digitizing it. We want that to be interoperable within different systems that CBs operate or CBs have or the recyclers have. So we are ensuring that transition of information is possible from the supplier to the recycler and then down the supply chain. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I don't see anything else coming in the box right now, so maybe I'll pass it back to you, Laura, to close this out.
Yeah, great. So like Callie had mentioned, this is the last in our series of webinars. So we had the full launch that covered a lot more background details in early June, and then went into the material specific sessions. From all of those sessions, we've collected questions that have come in. That first launch one, because it was a lot more content, we actually didn't get to answer a lot of those questions live like we did today. So we are going through and writing out our answers. So when we share the recordings, we're going to share out all of the Q&A that's come in across all of the webinars as well, so that the whole community can benefit from reading those. And then, of course, other questions welcome at any time. You can send them to the standards@textileexchange.org email address, and then just stay tuned on the hub and through our newsletters to find out updates. But with that, thank you very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your days and evenings.